So for topic 2 of module 2, we are going to be discussing evolution. And there's going to be a lot of terms that I need to introduce you to. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about terminology and then talking about what evolution actually is. After that, we will discuss the different ways that evolution can happen and the evidence for macroevolution, which is essentially speciation or new species showing up. So what evidence do we have that that occurs through evolution? Finally, we will talk about how speciation occurs, and then we'll talk a little bit about how to see different species as related individuals on a phylogenetic tree. As usual, this lecture will be split up into several smaller versions so that you can watch one bit at a time instead of having a whole lecture over the entire outline. So to start out, we need to discuss some terminology that's going to help you understand some of the concepts we're going to talk about. These are some definitions you may have had in some of your readings already. I'm not sure exactly when you get exposed to these, either in the evolution readings or possibly in the natural selection readings. But I'm going to be using some of these terms as we go through the information in this PowerPoint, so I need to make sure that you are familiar with what these all mean. So first, we're basically looking at a hierarchy of the order of life. So we're going to start with individuals, and then we're going to move up to larger and larger scales when we talk about the terminology. So the first term is organism, and what an organism is, this actually should say a single individual. An organism is a single individual. So if you say organism, you don't mean species, you mean a single living thing. Several organisms of the same species will make up a population. So a population is a group of interacting organisms, all of the same species, in the same area. So this down here is a population of flowers that are all the same species, and you can see that they are close enough together that they are interacting in some way. Possibly pollen is being moved from one plant to the other. So population is a group of interacting organisms, all of the same species. Well, I'm using the word species, but I haven't defined what a species is, and that's not even it's not even illustrated in this picture. But a species is basically a group of organisms that have similar characteristics, so they typically look similar to one another, and they are successfully able to interbreed with one another. So if two individuals can interbreed successfully and have offspring, we are going to call those things occupying the same species. Now things can get complicated. There are hybrids of two species hybridizing and having offspring, but we are going to keep things simple and just use the definition that if two things can interbreed and have offspring, we're just going to call that they belong to the same species. Okay, so the difference between a species and a population is that a population is a small group of individuals of the same species that are interacting with one another, and a species can encompass many different populations. Okay, so this could be a population in this one area, but there could be another population of that same species 15 miles away, which would mean that they're both of the same species, but those two populations aren't interacting with one another because they're too far away. Okay, so what is a community then? A community is a group of interacting populations of different species. So if you're looking at this big field, okay, there's a population of these purple flowers, there's a population of these white flowers, there's a population of deer, there's a population of other grasses. All of these different populations are interacting in a single community. So a community is a bunch of populations of different species in a single area all interacting. And an ecosystem is that same community, or we could call it the same community, but now it's going to encompass some of the abiotic or non-living factors, such as the soil and the temperature and how much oxygen there is and how much water there is. So the ecosystem is really just a community plus the non-living factors, and we often call those abiotic factors. So we don't just have to learn some ecological terms to understand what's going on in this module, but we also have to learn some genetics terms to understand evolution. You've probably seen some of these terms before, but I just want to refamiliarize you so that we're all kind of on the same page. So let's start out with what a chromosome is. I know it's in a weird order in the text over here, but a chromosome is a structure that's made up of coiled DNA, and you know that DNA is the code that we have that essentially determines who we are and what we look like. Everything in our body is determined by the code of our DNA. So our DNA is formed in structures called chromosomes. So there's a lot of details here that I'm going to leave out, and that's okay, but we have many sets of chromosomes, and a chromosome looks kind of like this. This is just coiled up DNA. And one of the things that a term that's not actually on here, but you need to know what it is a gene. So at a certain region of a chromosome, you will have a gene. So let's say that gene codes for eye color or something. So here's two chromosomes. They're chromosomes of the same type. They both have the same genes on them, but here we have two different alleles for the same gene. So if this was eye color, this allele would code for one eye color, and this allele would code for a different eye color. So if we go over to the definition of what an allele is one form of a gene. This is a little complicated, but all you need to know is that an allele is a particular form of a gene, and most genes have multiple alleles. In this case, we're just showing that this gene has two different alleles, but they could have, a dozen possible alleles for that specific gene. In this case, it's just two different alleles for that gene. When we are talking about these other terms, I should say that every person, and you probably know this, has two copies of every type of chromosome. So you have pairs of chromosomes. You got one set of chromosomes from your mom and one set of chromosomes from your dad, but those chromosomes are the same chromosomes. They just might have a different alleles on them. So everyone has basically two copies of the same gene. Every single gene, you have two copies of it. In some cases, you might have the same allele from your mom that you have from your dad. That would look something like this, okay? So if you got the same allele from your mom and your dad for a particular gene, that would mean that you are homozygous. So you have a big A and a big A. If you got a big A from your mom for a particular gene and a little a from your dad for a particular gene, that means you are heterozygous. If you got a little a from your mom and a little a from your dad, you're also homozygous, but just for a different allele. Okay, so I think I've covered homozygous or homozygote and heterozygote. What I haven't covered is phenotype and genotype. So the genotype is the makeup of all of your DNA. So all of your genes, all of your alleles, that tells what your genotype is. Your phenotype is actually how those genes are interpreted into what you look like and what you act like. So the phenotype is the form that is shown, your outward appearance. So let's say that a big A and a little a for eye color, combination of that means you have green eyes. your genotype would be big A, little a, and your phenotype would be green eyes. If any of that is confusing, I am happy for you guys to bring that up on Muddiest Point, but you're also going to get some of this terminology in many of the activities that you're going to be doing in this module, so probably a lot of it will clear up as well by doing some of the activities. So now we really need to talk about what is evolution, and it's a little bit complicated because a lot of times evolution can mean different things to different people. For the majority of the class, we're really going to be talking about microevolution, or at least the next video, we'll be talking about microevolution. Microevolution is evolution at a small scale, and it's simply the change in allele frequencies in a population over time. So remember, alleles are like the big A and the little a from the last slide. If you had 100 individuals in a population, and you had a frequency of half of the alleles in that population were big A's and half of the alleles in the population were little a's, then microevolution could be demonstrated by if those individuals reproduced and had offspring, and the frequency of alleles in the next population was 75% big A's and 25% little a's. So even if the phenotype doesn't really change very much, or if you can't notice a difference in a population over time, if there's anything about the number of alleles that has changed from one generation to the next, that's evolution. So at least it's microevolution. So it's a change in allele frequencies in populations over time. That might be confusing right now, but we're going to see so many examples of it that I think that will clear itself up. Microevolution does not have to do with new species. It is typically, you can see microevolution taking place in real time, so humans can actually witness microevolution. This isn't the best example actually of microevolution over here, because a wolf and a red wolf are actually different species, and a red wolf and a dog are different species, but you can see that this is evolution over sort of a smaller scale than typically what we mean by macroevolution. Macroevolution is the actual appearance of new species. And so we will use macroevolution to discuss the tree of life and how different species are arising from more ancient species. So macroevolution and microevolution have the same mechanisms. It's just that microevolution can occur in a single generation, and macroevolution would take thousands or millions of years. Macroevolution is much harder to see in real time, although there are probably some examples of it. So in order for us to really witness or understand macroevolution, we use a lot of different types of evidence to sort of reason how macroevolution occurs. So that's the end of the first video for topic 2.